Hello, BookTube. Well, today is our second read-along for the month of May. We're doing in May a series of really short but really important books. And like an idiot, at the end of the last read-along, I neglected either to check my original schedule or to make up a new one and tell you what we'd be reading this week. This Sunday, is The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. And since I didn't really announced that until yesterday. It's probably true that most of you didn't read it. And so I'll make this video kind of short because we will fix this, as this is an ongoing process. We will be doing read-alongs on this channel forever. And I intend to vary them up as much as I can. This is a perfect example of what happens when I try to get too creative. But I think we can still make it work. So we'll talk a little about young Werther today. And then the key thing here is that next week we're reading The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And it's not going to take you long. It's not at all the same kind of reading experience as this book is. It's not even close, in my opinion. Not even close. The easy joke being that Goethe wrote much better English than Conrad, even though Conrad wrote his book in English and Goethe did not. But I'm going to try next week, when we talk about The Heart of Darkness, I'm going to try to limit the number of gratuitous ad hominem swipes I make at Joseph Conrad. For now, we're going to concentrate just briefly. I won't make this a long video because I'm not sure that how many of you have read this book because of me. I screwed it up. In June, we will be reading one long work, and we won't have to worry about this. But today we're going to concentrate on this little book, which is in two parts, and it's epistolary. So it's all the letters that Werther is writing to a group of people, either to Lottie, the young woman that he loves, or to his friend, his logical, grounded, real-world friend, or in response to his mother, who has ambitions for him, for his career. We don't ever get anybody else's letters. We just get his. So there is a very strong feeling in this book of what the 21st century would call an echo chamber. But the thing was written in a month. We still read it. We still consider it a part of canon. And I think it fundamentally changed the nature and the landscape of German literature. And yet it was written in a month by a 20-something lawyer. The inspiration came on him. Goethe was an incredibly fast worker when he wanted to be. The older he got and the grander he got and the more his reputation grew, the slower he could be. But the way that you could always tell, now it's of course an arcane art that no one does anymore, the way you could always tell is letter writing. And even late in life, when the mood was on him, Goethe could sit at his table or in bed and write a finished letter without blotting. without redrafting anything, that was just thrilling, just incredibly thrilling. No other word for it. And I think that is a good sign that the fire that burned in this book never really left him, not completely. But this is a story of a young man who has a dreamy, aspirational nature. He doesn't want to become a cog in society. He doesn't want to become a horse at the plow. He doesn't want what his mother wants for him. His mother wants a career for him, placements in the diplomatic service or at court or something like that, something to make a living, something to make a man of himself in society. Whereas he wants to dream, or you know, as the refrain throughout the book is, to reach for the infinite. And he also wants Lottie. He also wants this wonderful really caricature of a pure and beautiful girl, and things happen in the book. Werther is an interesting young man. He has you get glimpses when you read his own accounts in his letters. You get glimpses of the grown man that he would have been. His love of literature, for instance. There have been many a young undergraduate paper written on his two favorite poets, both of whom are in a way imaginary. It's not known to Goethe at the time, but he loves Homer and he loves the poet Ossian. And Homer is, of course, a conglomeration. He's just a placeholder figure. We don't know who that person was, or if there was one person. Of course, there wasn't just one person behind the generation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but even if you talk about the person who wrote them down in that form or codified them in that form, the form that we have them now, or however you want to put it, it's still probably many people, not one. And of course, Ossian turned out to be an entirely fake poet, not just a conglomeration, but a fraud. But it's not just the poetry; it's also the way Werther, the way he interacts with other people. The limited amount that we see reflected in his letters, that he's good with children, he's good with most people, and it makes you wonder that, of course, this book has spawned an infinite amount of pastiche fiction in its day, because, and again, I don't think I'm giving away anything here for a 200-year-old novel that was so popular that it was just a fad all over the reading world, and that at the end of the book, young Werther has worked himself up to committing suicide, and it's a little bit unclear why he does that. He has two reasons, or at least what he thinks of as reasons. One is that he has come to decide that because he worms his way out of the appointments that his mother manages to make for him. One is that he has decided that his spirit, his nature, is just fundamentally incompatible with the dog-eat-dog, hand-to-mouth existence of the real world. And the other is that he doesn't think he can have the girl of his dreams. And one particular reader of The Sorrows of Young Werther, everybody loved this book. Everybody read it. Everybody read it many times. It was an enormous fad, had an enormous influence on literature, not just in Germany. Of course, it sold like hotcakes right away. As soon as as Goethe and his publisher brought it out, it sold out and kept selling out. The Leipzig Book Fair, where it initially made its full case appearance, couldn't hold on to copies, and there were more and more reprinted and pirated and parodied and whatnot. One reader pointed out to Goethe directly that those two reasons for killing yourself are exclusive, and that the book would be stronger if there were only one. That reader had read the book by his own attestation 7 times. And that reader was Napoleon Bonaparte, who took Goethe to task, and Goethe, of course, had to do a little dance to satisfy the emperor as to why and when and where. What are you going to do when a moron who happens to have control over the life and death of millions of people criticizes your little book? And there are a couple of things I want to talk about this book just briefly before we go, because I think this video is kind of wasted in a couple of ways. One is that it's pouring rain here, so I don't think it's going to upload. And two is that I'm not sure how many of you read this book, to go along with today. Next time will be different. Heart of Darkness will be different. I think it'll also be much more familiar to a lot of you. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to take you through with this book. And the first one deals with translation. I have talked on this channel many times, many times, about how I distrust translations. The more I encounter them, the less I trust them. And I wanted to go through that with this book. I want to pick one passage and go through it. I'll read it to you in a few different translations, so you can see what I mean. You can see the very different feel that you get. This is a passage in which our young hero has joined an evening soiree without really realizing that he and his level of society are not welcome at it. The man whose soiree it is likes him very much, and isn't going to yell at him or anything like that. But he does take him aside. I'll read you that. This is from the Penguin Classic translation, which is by Michael Hulse. Let me see if I can get to. Yes, at length the Count approached me and took me aside in the bay of a window. You know how absurd things are, he said. I gather the company takes exception to your presence here, and I should not wish on any account. Your Excellency, I interrupted, I beg 1,000 pardons. I should have thought of it sooner, but I trust you will forgive the oversight. I had intended to take my leave some time ago, but my wicked demon prevented me. I added, smiling and bowing. The Count shook my hand feelingly in a manner that spoke volumes. I made my inconspicuous disappearance from the illustrious assembly and left, took a two-wheeler, and drove out to M to stand on the hill and watch the sunset and read that magnificent book in Homer where Odysseus enjoys the hospitality of his excellent swineherd, which was all very pleasant. That evening I returned to supper. There were still a few people in the parlor who had turned back the tablecloth and were playing dice on a corner of the table. Then Adeline, a worthy fellow, came in, laid down his hat on seeing me coming over to me, and said softly, "You have had a trying experience, I gather." "Me?" I said. "The Count turned you out of the assembly." "The devil take them," said I. "I was glad to be out in the fresh air." "So much the better," said he, "that you can take it so lightly. I confess it distresses me. It is already all over town." At this point, the business first began to upset me. Whenever anyone came and sat at the table and looked at me, I thought he was looking at me because of it, which made for bad feelings. So that is Michael Hulse's translation. Now, the next one we're going to do is this Modern Library edition, which has this has a painting on the cover. This is a detail from Philipp Otto Runge's self-portrait, which the original hangs in Hamburg. This cover is very different. The Modern Library edition is very different. It's a handsome young man crying. And this one, the translation is by Burton Pike. I'm going to read the exact same passage, and you'll note, I'm sure, right away, the differences. The Count came up to me and took me aside in a window niche. "You know," he said, "our peculiar customs. I notice that these people are displeased to see you here. I would not for anything want to—" "Your Excellency," I interrupted, "I beg your pardon 1,000 times. I should have thought of it before, and I know you will forgive the indiscretion. I was about to take my leave earlier, and an evil genius held me back." I added, smiling as I bowed. The Count pressed my hand with a feeling that said everything. I softly slipped away from the aristocratic party, got into a cabriolet, and rode to M to watch the sun setting from the hill, and meanwhile to read in my Homer the wonderful passages about how Ulysses is welcomed and cared for by the splendid swineherds. All that was good. In the evening I came back for supper there. There were still a few people in the inn. They were casting dice on a corner of the table from which they had folded back the cloth. Then Honorable Adeline comes in, looks at me as he puts down his hat, comes over to me and says softly, "You are upset?" "Me?" I said. "The Count made you leave the party." "The devil take them," I said. "I was happy to get out into the open air. It's good," he said, "that you take it lightly. But I'm vexed that it's already all over the place." Then the thing really began to gnaw at me. All those who came to the table and were looking at me, I thought, did so on that account. That made for bad blood. And one other difference that you're not going to be able to tell from that reading is that this is just dashes. This has no quotation marks, nothing like that. And that is Burton Pike's translation. And then we move on. We're going to move on to the W.W. Norton paperback that came out, I think, must have been recently, because I still have a pub sheet in here. I don't know if I have the date on this. 2012. This came out in 2012. And you'll notice right away the title is different. This is The Sufferings of young Werther. The word can be the same. The word, it's neither translator is taking liberties. I myself think that suffering is better. Sorrow seems a little wan. Sorrow seems like what this guy's going through. But this is by Stanley Korngold, who is, among other things, notable for a fantastic translation of Kafka's Metamorphoses. And this will be the last one. This will be the last one that we do. The Count came up to me and drew me into a window niche. "You are familiar," he said, "with our wonderful conditions. The company is displeased, I notice, to see you here. I would not want under any circumstances—" "Your Excellency," I interrupted, "1,000 pardons. I should thought of it sooner, and I know you will forgive me this lapse. I meant to leave a while ago. An evil genius held me back," I added, smiling as I bowed. The Count squeezed my hands with an emotion that said it all. I slipped quietly away from the distinguished company, went out and got into a cabriolet, and drove to M, there to watch the sunset from the hill and read in my Homer of the splendid scene where Ulysses enjoys the hospitality of an excellent swineherd. All that was well and good. In the evening I returned for supper. There were only a few people in the tap room playing dice on one corner of a table. They had turned the cloth back. Then the honest A comes in and says quietly, "Have you had a bad time?" I said. "The Count ordered you out of his company." "The devil take it," I said. "I was glad to get out into the fresh air." "It's good," he says, "that you're taking it so lightly. The only thing that annoys me is that it's already all over the place. That's when the thing really began to get under my skin. Everyone who came to the table and looked at me made me think, he's looking at you because of that. It made my blood boil." Those are three translations of the Sorrows or the Sufferings of Young Werther, however you like it, that are in bookstores now, and they're similar, but considering that this is the German of only 2 centuries ago, they're not identical. They're not even close. There are plurals instead of singulars. There are names instead of initials. There are Western English conventions like quote marks, and 2 of the translations call a two-wheeler a cabriolet. One does not. 2 identify Ulysses. 1 changes the Latin into Odysseus. And the feel of it is different too. In 2 of the translations, Werther, I think, is a lot more forceful than in the third one. It's not meant as anything, definitive. It's just meant to show that even in a work that's comparatively recent, if you know what I mean, even in a work where there shouldn't, in my opinion, be this much variation, there still is. That was mainly meant as an illustration of why I tend to distrust translations, because that a German today could read easily, could pick up a document of German from 200 years ago and read it easily. It's basically the same language. Same thing with, how many millions of Americans troop to Washington, D.C. and read documents from 200 years ago in America. So that's what I mean by comparatively recent. And in that time, even there, the will and whimsy of translators will give you a substantially different reading experience. Not so much maybe in that passage, but it accumulates over time. And the effect of reading this in German, as opposed to any English translation, is just, it's pronounced. And that just gets worse when a work is more complicated, when a work is longer, or when a work is much older. So that's one of the things I wanted to point out about this book. And the other thing I wanted to point out about it is the enormous shadow that it cast, the enormous thing that it carved out, a niche that it carved out on its own. This was written by a 20-something author who was a lawyer but had dreams of other things. It is extremely autobiographical, except for the killing yourself part. Goethe went on to a ripe old age. But aside from that, it's noticeably so. Let's just say it noticeably maps onto Goethe's own life up until that point. And it was written quickly, in other words, without revision. And yes, this man was an incredible genius, but that pattern has stayed true and has been replicated many times in the ensuing 2 centuries by writers who are not geniuses. That pattern exists with us today. It's all over the contemporary fiction that we see on this channel every week. All the sad young literary men, these young passionate men who think that simply transcribing the events of their lives and doing it quickly and without revision will lead to a runaway success, like it did with this book. They, of course, don't know this book. They've never read it. They've never heard of it. But it still works, is my point, is that it still works. It's not just that pattern applies to the authors. It also applies to the audience. It still works. We still get books like that, and they still do really well. So Werther is with us still. But anyway, now is the point in this video where I would, of course, ask you what you think, what you thought of this book, whether or not it was anything like what you were expecting, whether or not you read it in English, that sort of thing. But I can't really do that this time around because I announced it yesterday. So I'm not thinking that any of you actually read this for today. But that's okay. That was my own fault. Next time will be different. Next week we will do The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which will be familiar to a great many of you. Probably read it in school. And we'll see where that goes. That is for sure. And the week after that, we're going to read The Prince by Machiavelli. And that will close out May. Those 2 will end out May. And when we read The Prince, when we gather in 2 weeks to read The Prince, then we'll talk about June. then we'll know for June. We'll have made plans for June by then. I'm going to wrap this up for now. With apologies again for the screw up of this reading schedule, but we'll get back on track next week. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.